Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Imola post-race reaction. What was your thoughts of this race? Did you enjoy it? Did the last 10 laps make up for the non-action for the most of the race? Or were you one of the people like me that even with that little tightening of the, gap there between Lando and Max, that gap coming down fairly rapidly even, that it didn't really make up for the dull race that we had for the most of the laps. And not a whole lot of, pit strategy differences that really made any kind of movement in the field. So what was your thoughts? I was having a hard time gaining that expertise of like, oh yeah, this is going to be a really good race. We're going to see a battle for the win. As Lando even said that he got up close, and of course then his tires were heating up, and so then he had to take a couple of laps to figure out how to get around that. And by that point, it was the last lap, and so he really didn't have a good chance of really taking over that position with Max. Whether it would be on the straightaways and then having the corners, where Max would come back, or vice versa, having the corners and then have the straightaways with the DRS. And so we didn't have that battle. We didn't have that tense moment for me. It was all the build up, but no execution on that front. So I think that was kind of a letdown in my view. And so with no really pit strategy going on that really played into the race at all, for the most part. I mean, there were some bits and pieces here and there, but nothing that really was significant in that front. So I would probably give this probably a 4 out of 10, just below average, because the end kind of made it exciting, but we didn't get the payoff from it. But what was your thoughts? And like normal, I'm going to go through the drivers from last to first and kind of give you my thoughts and potentially what happened to them, and kind of give you some information on those and my opinion on how they did. So without further ado, we will start off. Sorry about that. With Alex Albon, who ended up pulling that Williams into the pits after he pitted on lap 9, switching from mediums to hards, and they didn't quite get that wheel nut completely attached. He said it was a little bit of wiggle room. It was safe to go around the track, and then he had a pit, which put them down a lap, and then due to that, he was back on mediums, and he was going around the track and just a couple laps behind, and I think they just decided to just pull that Williams in, as it wasn't giving them any kind of information beyond what they've already gathered. And so I think they were just trying to save up some extra laps because they weren't getting anywhere in this race after that issue. Even though Alex said that this is probably the best that Williams has felt overall on the setup kind of configuration of balancing on that car throughout the race. So hopefully they can carry that forward into the next race and kind of see if they can actually gain some ground on that, of course, qualifying, because we know how that's going to be next week, or next couple weeks, sorry, in the Monaco GP, where the qualifying is everything. So hopefully they can really bring that and get that most out of it so that they can kind of run with that in Monaco. And Fernando Alonso was another one of those that really didn't get anywhere in this race. He qualified in 19th, but then ended up starting off in 20th position after some changes. So he started from the pits lane, started off on a set of softs, trying to throw it out in the wind to see if something would actually stick, doing a completely different strategy. So starting off on softs and ended up pitting on lap 8 to switch to hards. And then on 41, he switched to another set of mediums. And I believe, I'm not positive on this because I didn't hear anything directly from them on this front, but I think on lap 61, he pitted again and went to another set of softs. I was thinking that he was going to try to get that fastest lap, which he was not able to do, or for some reason, or gain some ground on that front. So he is pretty much, day was shot from the start after having that wreck in early in the free practice 3, which then they had to rebuild for qualifying, and he didn't get the position alignment on the track for doing any kind of qualifying. So I started off at the back of the pack, and I think this was just more of a learning situation, trying to potentially gain anything if something weird happened and they had a safety car or something to that effect that would have helped them out, which didn't, of course. If you watch the race, we didn't have any safety cars or red flags or any of that, so it was kind of a all out. So any of the alternate strategies that were kind of depending on some of that stuff did not work. And I think Valtteri Bottas is probably in one of those lines. He basically started off on mediums, pit quite early on lap 9, I thought, switching to hards, and then he went the rest of the way on that set of hards. So at the end of the race, he had really used set of hard tires, and that made him drop back into the field to 18th position, where if he had been able to push out a little bit farther, I think on those mediums, he might have been up a little bit closer to where his teammate was in that running, who was on the opposite strategy that he was. Not a lot to say for Bottas. Hopefully he can kind of rebound again in Monaco to see if he does usually a pretty good job in qualifying. So hopefully he can qualify a little bit higher and be able to maintain that position in the race at Monaco. Logan Sargent had a pretty uneventful day as well. He really qualified in 20th position, but got pushed up to 19th because of Fernando Alonso. Worked his way up to 17th during the race. Some of that is on merit. I mean, Alonso did pit again, but he was ahead of a couple people, which was good to see. He did fight a little bit with Bottas and was able to pass him on lap 63 for that 17th position. So, did a little bit of work, but not really the strong point for them. He did finish ahead of his teammate because of the issue that Alex had, I think mainly with that wheel nut, and then they decided to just pull in, just save the vehicle for any kind of potential damages that would have occurred after that. So Logan Sargent kind of ended up in that 17th position, which has looked good, but on paper, but not necessarily great in the race. So hopefully he can still make some progress, even though I don't think his seat is going to be there for him next season, especially if he continues the stagnant progression that he has made. So hopefully he can figure out what makes it click and really get some extra advancements in that Williams for him so he can kind of learn the best. Pierre Gasly qualified in 15th, dropped down to 16th. He was doing pretty much the same thing. He started off on softs, pitted on lap 9 for hards, went to lap 31, and then switched back to mediums. The only thing I have him really in the mix on is passing Bottas on lap 62 for that 16th position. So he kind of basically stayed at the very back of the pack, not really able to gain much ground or do any kind of maneuvers to get around people, kind of sticking in that backfield. So Alpine is really struggling still, even though they had a decent race last week. They're still having to try to figure out where they are and get the best out of that Alpine so that they can proceed doing some more improvements on that car to help them get more into that running for points. Guan Yu Zhou was on the opposite strategy as Valtteri. He qualified in 17th, worked his way up to 15th, so that's decent. He started off on hards, which generally didn't work out for most people, but I guess it tended to do a decent job for him. Went to lap 34, switched to mediums, and was still pretty, nose to tail, tail to nose, not being able to make much ground around the back of the pack. He did pass his teammate on lap 61 for 16th position. And so I didn't see where he moved up to that 15th position, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But still, not that great for the Sauber Kick Stake F1 team. They still need a lot of ground. I need Audi to really come in there and start putting some investment into that team so that they can kind of make some progress and hopefully advance before Audi takes complete control. Esteban Ocon qualified in 12th and ended up in 14th. He passed Bottas on lap 61 for 14th position. He started off on mediums and went to hards, but he went a long stint on those mediums. He went to lap 26, I think it was, before switching to hards. Still not quite where it needed to be, and he started getting past because it was a little bit farther up with the newer tires or better tire formats. So still kind of a dull race for him, I think, in regards to that. Daniel Ricciardo looked like he was going to do okay, qualifying in 9th, but he dropped back to 13th. He did lose 2 spots on the start, so that didn't help him out any. And then he basically was kind of stuck in that backpack, not being able to make a whole lot of maneuvers and get around people. And so he ended up dropping back into that 13th position as other people and other strategies worked out a little bit better than that RB did for him. Kevin Magnussen was actually doing fairly well. It's kind of bad that he got blocked on qualifying, so he ended up in 18th position. He worked his way up to 12th, which I was kind of interested in seeing. He basically stayed at the back of the pack until near the end, where then he started making some maneuvers on people. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that pretty much all his positions were kind of gained at the end, where other people were on slightly different tire strategies that played into that effect. So Kevin did gain 2 positions on the start, so he did have a decent start. He did start on mediums and then switch to hards on lap 38. I have him passing Juan Yuzhou on lap 49 for 15th, Ocon on lap 51 for 14th, Bottas on 52 for 13th, and Daniel Ricciardo on lap 63 for 12th. So, as I said, like all of his maneuvers and stuff, and he worked his way up, at that back part of that race, really gained some ground on some people. So I think that's hopeful for him, even though he didn't quite get to the point standing areas or fights. If he can get a better qualifying position, maybe that Haas can do a little bit better on the tire strategy or something that they can maneuver more into points. I know he's having some bad luck lately, but it's hard to know if that's self-induced or if that's more of other things going on. And of course, even with all those passes, he didn't get kind of in trouble because he's really on that edge of getting in trouble and getting that race banned. So that was kind of interesting to see as well, kind of how that played out in his driving style. Nico Hülkenberg, I think, didn't quite like the strategy they put him on. Excuse me. He started off in 10th and dropped down to 11th. He did gain 2 positions on the start of the race. He did pass Sargent on lap 28 for 13th. He did start on mediums like his teammate, but he pitted early on lap 15 and switched to hards. I think they were trying to head off some of the lower end teams, trying to see if they would not gain that ground, which I think that hurt them in the long run because it put him back in the back of the pack farther, where he had to work his way around some issues with them cars trying to get by people. So that hurt him overall, I think, with Juan Yuzhou and some other folks that are pitted way early and trying to undercut some folks. And Haas tried to, wane that off with Nico Hülkenberg, and they probably should have just done their own strategy and went longer instead of pitting him. So he got outside that point range just barely into that 11th position, which is always hard to see. As you're a driver, it's like just at that edge of getting points, but not quite. And of course, it hurts when the team that you're really trying to gain ground on is RB, and they get that last position into the points as well. So they get in points and you're not. Really hurts in the Haas team format. So that gives me the bottom half. The top half, as I already kind of hinted at, Yuki Tsunoda ended up in that 10th position, gaining that last point for RB. He did qualify in 7th, so I think he was hoping that he could gain a little bit more in this race than he did. He had didn't have a very good start, so losing 2 positions at the start of the race. So I think RB needs to kind of look at that since both team members had issues on the start and see if they can develop or figure out what they're doing wrong and get a better start. That will help them out as well on these races. So if he can gain that ground, he did actually a decent job in this race and was able to work his way still into those points. So that's always good to see Yuki doing that. I see he gained a position from Hulkenberg. I think it was when Hulkenberg pitted, which I think Hulkenberg was kind of pissed off at when they pitted him early to cut off, some of the lower end teams that were pitting early. And then I have him basically passing Sargent on lap 28th for 12th and getting into the 11th position as well on lap 33. So he did start off on mediums and went to hards, doing a decent job. I think he was hoping that he could get a little bit more out of this run than he did, but it's still a good positive for RB that they're getting points in this running and gaining that a little bit of gap between them and the Haas team on point strategy, edging them out at the last couple of races. So RB is in a good direction. Haas is potentially there, but not quite there. So I think it's hurting Haas a little bit more than it is RB in that sense of RB gaining points, the ability to gain points when Haas seems to be just on the outside edge, not quite able to figure out what the strategy is for that. So that gap is growing over the last several races. Lance Stroll did a decent job, even though his teammate was way at the back of the pack. It's hard to say how good that Aston Martin is overall, but he was doing a decent job. Qualified in 13th, worked his way up to 9th. He started off on mediums and went to lap 38 before switching to hards. I have him passing Hulkenberg on lap 47 for 10th and passing Tsunoda on lap 50 for that 9th position. So decent run for Lance. It just seems like he should be able to gain a little bit more out of that Aston Martin when I see some of the stuff that Alonso does. Of course, Alonso had a bad week, so it's hard to say how well that Aston Martin worked here in Imola. Sergio Perez is kind of on the same situation, but on the backside, that Red Bull, he qualified in 11th and made his way to 8th. I basically have him gaining 1 position on the start of the race, and then he went off the track and into the gravel, losing 5 seconds. So his gap between him and the people ahead of him kind of dropped. So he had to gain that ground again, which didn't help him at all. He did pass Daniel Ricciardo on lap 38 for 10th and passed Hulkenberg on lap 40 for 9th. And he worked his way up to 8th due to some of the shuffles of the top. So not the greatest run for Sergio Perez, but of course not one of his worst either. So still gaining a couple of points for Red Bull, which is always good to see. Hopefully he's doing enough to keep that seat. I know that seat is the hot seat, or one of the hot seats for this season, to see who can actually maintain that position, if they're going to be swapping that out or not. So how that goes, we'll have to wait and see, and that might trigger a domino effect if someone actually gets thrown into that position, or earlier in the season than the end of the season. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Then we have George Russell, who qualified in 6th and ended up in 7th. He seems to be doing better in the races than his teammate, but not quite as good, or whatever in the runnings that he's seen. So it seems like Lewis maybe can do better in the race than qualifying, and George is better in the qualifying than the race. How that works, I'm not positive. But he did pass Ocon on lap 23 for ninth, and he did pass Perez on lap 31 for sixth. He did box on lap 22 from mediums to hards, and then he did another box on lap 53 from hards to mediums, and was able to get the fastest lap, which gave him the extra point, which is good to see. Someone from the lower top 10 gain that position over the top runs, so that you get a little bit more of that gap down on those lower end folks than the top end folks. But as I said, George is kind of there. You saw a couple of passes from him, but for the most part, just kind of stayed like most of everybody in this race kind of just stayed in the position they were qualified in, except for the start of the race. So they kind of got in the order and kind of just stayed there for the most part. His teammate was just ahead of him in sixth, and Lewis qualified in eighth. Lewis did gain a position on the start of the race. He did also go off into the gravel at one point in time, so he didn't lose quite as much time, I don't think, as Stroll did, but was able to pull it back in. He started off on mediums and switched to hards on lap 28. He did pass Stroll on lap 34 for 8th, and then passed Perez on lap 37 for 7th. So he was doing a decent job there. I must have missed how he got into that 6th position, if that was the case. He might have been someone else, might have had a longer stint and then pitted, that dropped him out of that running. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but doing a decent job for Lewis, even though I said that he doesn't feel like they're gaining a whole lot of ground, just minute pieces here and there. Not really competitive with the Ferraris and the McLarens and the Red Bulls at this point in time, but hopefully will gain ground to that position in the future. So they're kind of the step behind the top runner field at this point in time. Still doing fairly better than Aston Martin in RB, but not quite hanging with the top runners in this season. Hopefully those updates will come. I know they're working hard at Mercedes. Carlos Sainz qualified in 4th and ended up in 5th. He said they had some issues that they discovered during this race, but it sounded like it wasn't setup issues. It was some kind of more issues with the car or something to that effect, that it's actually hurting the Ferraris a little bit more. So hopefully they were able to do something to fix that. But not having the greatest run, but not having a bad run either for him in this run. Doing a decent job. He did pass Perez on lap 30 for that 5th position and kind of maintained that overall. So as I said, not a great run, but not a bad run for Carlos Sainz. Oscar Piastri, of course, had that 3-place grid penalty for hindering Kevin Magnussen in qualifying. So he dropped down to the 5th position for qualifying, even though he actually qualified in 2nd. Worked his way up to 4th. He did start off on mediums and then switched to hards on lap 24, like a lot of folks. Passed Stroll on lap 25 for 7th, and passed Perez on lap 27th for 6th. So I think he was doing fairly good. He said he was kind of he'd get a good stint and try to push, and then got past Perez, and then he thought he could make it up to, the next Charles Leclerc, if I can speak to, and so he was like, "Ooh, I can do that," and so he started pushing there, and then it was kind of like getting his tires a little heated more than they should have been, and so then he had to back off, and he said that sounds like what Charles had with Lando at one point, where Charles Leclerc was, gaining ground on Lando, and then at some point it just kind of ended and started backing off into the same time period that he saw himself in. So he thought that was kind of weird for those tires, but it just kind of shows that it's he's kind of there right on pace with the champions, and so I think he's going to have a good win at some point in time this season for himself. being able to really mix it up there in the front runner. So we'll wait to see if that occurs or not, but I hope it does, because that'll give us some extra drivers in the mix for that front runner position. Charles Leclerc, again, qualified in third, ended up in third. He did pass Perez on lap 27 for fifth, and basically went from mediums to hards, like the front runners, kind of stayed out there. I think at one point when he pitted, he got shuffled behind Oscar, so he actually had to go past Oscar due to some issues, and so that hurt him a little bit, but overall, a good race for Charles Leclerc. Lando Norris, of course, again qualified in second, and ended up in second. He did pass Perez on lap 24 for fifth. Started off on mediums, switched to hards on lap 23. He was the driver of the day. If it wasn't for him, I could easily see Max being the driver of the day, being able to take that pole position, keep the pole position, and then when pressure was on him, maintain that. So I think that would be a good driver of the day, or possibly Kevin Magnussen coming back at the second part of the race, being able to gain as much ground as he did. What was your driver of the day? In this running for Lando, he was kind of falling back at the very beginning. Said he didn't have a very good stint on the first stint, and the second stint was better on those hards than the Red Bulls were on their hards, and where the Red Bulls were better on the mediums. So he was gaining ground. He was losing ground at the beginning, then started gaining ground at the end. So if he had a better first half, then he might have been able to put more pressure on Max. So I said that's a good standing for McLaren to be in. Hopefully they can kind of figure out if there's anything they could have done for that, or possibly balance it out a little bit better so that he can have a better chance of putting pressure and having that fight for the front with Max Verstappen. And I'll get to the times here when I go through Max, which is right now. So basically Max qualified in first, ended up in first. He did start off a medium, switched to hards on lap 24. He actually got a black and white flag for track limits at one point. So he was on the verge of getting a penalty for track limits, which then put the pressure on a lot more when Lando was gaining ground on him, because he had to make sure that he was within track limits, because if he got that penalty, that would drop him back behind Norris for sure. So I think that was extra pressure that Max put on himself, so it wasn't the perfect race for him, even though it kind of looked really good at the beginning of the race. I have him with a 4.7 second lead at lap 15, a 6.3 second lead at lap 30, a 7.4 second lead at lap 45. So you can see that gaining ground as that race went through. But then when I pick it up here, and I don't know when the actual cutover was, I didn't actually look into that, but I have at lap 51, it was down to a 4.9. At lap 55, it was a 3.5. At lap 58, it was a 1.6. At 61, it was a 1.4. And finally, Max won with only a 0.725 second lead. So that gap was really dropping down quite significantly, and there was a lot of pressure on him, and he was saying it was kind of driving on ice on those hard tires. And of course, the more wear on those tires, he said, the worse it got. So he was having to really balance and really show his drivemanship going around that track, keeping ahead of Lando and not being able to let Lando just by when he was on the better set of tires and handling at that point in time. So there's potentially, and that's what everybody's talking about, is the potential, the hope that there's going to be some good fights for the win in the rest of the season, where McLaren is actually up there fighting the Red Bulls. And of course, the Ferraris aren't too far behind, so hopefully they can get there and make it a good three-way battle for that top position. And we'll have a lot more interesting races at the front of the field and not have to worry about the mid or back of the pit pack to find your race that you're really interested in. So in that regard, I think that was making this a lot more interesting of a race, and I think that's what a lot of people are getting away from this race, in the sense that, oh, it's a really good height because of that, seeing that time gap drop significantly gives us hope for that front runner battles that we all want to see. So if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe, and we'll get into the driver's standings. So what happened during this race? So basically, the backpack basically stayed the same. Lance gained a couple of points, but staying where he was in 11th, and Yuki gained a point staying in 10th. But what we do see is at the front of the pack, we see some changes here. Of course, Max Verstappen is still in the lead with 161 points. But now Charles Leclerc is second over Perez, now with 113 points over Sergio Perez's 107. Lando jumping Carlos Sainz back into that fourth position with 101, and Carlos dropping back into that fifth position with 93. And of course, with Oscar advancing as well, so that gap is probably going to see a little bit drop throughout the season, potentially, if the Ferraris don't figure out exactly how to compete more with the Red Bulls and the McLarens there. So that's the cool thing to see there, is that top runner getting a little bit closer and getting a little bit of changes there in this race. Now, what does it have for constructors? Not anything's changed in the constructor standings. It all kind of stays the same. You have Red Bull now with 268, followed by Ferrari with 212, McLaren with 154, Mercedes with 79, Aston Martin staying, well, gaining a couple points with 44, RB gaining that 1 point with 20, and then Haas, Alpine, Williams, and Stake kind of remaining where they were with those same exact point runs. So, what is next? It is Monaco, our wonderful track that we all love to see and yet hate at the same time. It will be on May 26th is the race, so we will have to see how that plays out. Of course, this is a 2.073 mile street circuit, so it'll have 78 laps for a total race distance of 161.734 miles. The lap record holder is Lewis Hamilton in 2021 with 1 minute 12.909 seconds. And this circuit was introduced to Formula One in 1950. So there's a lot of heritage. A lot of people love this track. I think a lot of people love the partying, the atmosphere at this track. And so this is one of the really favorites for a lot of people. But as of late, I know a lot of people hate this track because the cars are too big. So there's hardly any passing on the race circuit. Even though you do get some, it makes it really difficult in that terrain. So some people don't think it should be still on the race docket until they can be able to either fix the circuit or fix the cars to make them shrink to have a better layout and more passing on this circuit. So hopefully you'll enjoy this race in a couple of weeks. I think qualifying is going to be the excitement for this for the most part, because that's always the really edgy one of who can push it to the limit without hitting the barriers and the walls to try to gain that pole position. And then once the race starts, you'll get a little bit of action, but it's really hard to do anything unless the safety car comes out, and that's when you're going to get a lot more changes in position, I believe. So hopefully you can enjoy it, but until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.